And for more on all this, we are joined by DW correspondent Arthur Sullivan, who's live from Berlin. Arthur, thanks for being with us. This NATO meeting comes against the backdrop of conflict and now possible peace between Israel, Iran, and the US. Has NATO itself had much to say on the situation there?
Well, yes, of course, the situation in the Middle East with regards to Iran and Israel is not directly a NATO issue. I mean, you've just mentioned the situation with the war in Ukraine and obviously other issues that they're preoccupied at the moment with. But nonetheless, the conflict here that has been taking place over the last 10 days or so does provide a considerable backdrop. There have been protests in The Hague ahead of the summit, mostly with an anti-war message and obviously focused on what's been happening in Iran. But NATO and its Secretary-General Mark Rutte have not really addressed the issue too forcefully ahead of this. The big comment that Rutte made in advance of this summit about it was that he said the US attacks did not violate international law, the US attacks on Iran in recent days. And then yesterday there was quite a remarkable text message that Rutte had sent to Donald Trump, which Trump published and which NATO verified was indeed true, where the NATO leader praised the, quote, truly extraordinary and, quote, decisive action from the US, saying that it made us all safer, end quote. So going by that, at least, it doesn't look like there would be much dissent, if any, from within NATO regarding what has been happening in the Middle East in the last few days.
Arthur, NATO wants the member states to agree to raise defense spending to 3.5% of GDP with an extra 1.5% of GDP on security-rated infrastructure. Can it be agreed upon?
Yeah, well, that is the big issue. I mean, it's been a constant topic of Trump's since his very first term as president, and he is now obviously getting certain credit for the fact that NATO members have largely increased spending significantly. For years, that target was 2%, and for years, most of the countries failed to meet it. Now, all but 10 of the 32 members do indeed meet it. Now, of this new figure that they want to agree, that you've just mentioned, that 5%, 3.5% in defence, an extra 1.5% of GDP on defence-related infrastructure. The suggestion is that NATO has reached an agreement on it. I have seen a text that is reportedly the one they're going to release later, which seems to suggest that there is agreement. But there is one country that has been sort of holding out, and that's Spain. Spain currently doesn't meet the 2% threshold, and its leader, Pedro Sanchez, who is one of the few left-wing leaders in Europe, he has said that he doesn't think it's right to spend this kind of money on defence, that it would affect social spending in the country, it would affect their plans for the green transition. Now, the big question that we're going to find out as soon as this summit ends is what kind of opt-out, if any, has a country like Spain found? Because some leaders have said just right this morning in the last hour or so, there will be no opt-outs from the final text, that you either agree to the 5% or you don't, and if you don't, well then there isn't consensus. So it's interesting to see how Spain could possibly say that it's going to meet its commitments without spending this 5%. And I guess the worry in advance of this summit has been that if Spain were to achieve special status, other countries who perhaps currently also don't spend the 2%, then they may also say, well, we also want a special deal. And of course, that's not something that's likely to please President Trump, who, as we've seen in advance of this, NATO seems to be doing everything in its power not to upset him, not to offend him, to give him as much credit as possible, and to essentially butter him up to avoid any big confrontation at this summit.
Indeed, and for several years now, there have been existential questions about NATO's future, mostly regarding the US's role under President Trump. Can this meeting shore things up?
Well, certainly President Trump's views have dominated the NATO narrative for the guts of 10 years now. I mean, even when he wasn't president, the alliance was still essentially acting in a way that was probably in anticipation of his return to the White House. That's for good reasons. You know, the US is clearly by a mile NATO's most powerful member. Now, one very, very simple example of how this is so, his behaviour influences NATO so much. This summit has been made smaller to avoid the possibility of Trump walking out early, as he did from a G7 meeting just last week. So normally this would be a 3-day summit with several large meetings. Now it's just one big meeting between the leaders for 2.5 hours, which is happening right now. So that's one of the big reasons. Now, another big concern here, not just around the defence spending issue, has been this question of the US commitment. So on his flight to The Hague, Trump gave an interview to reporters and he said, regarding the famous Article 5 of NATO, that's the article that says one attack on a member of NATO is an attack on all members. Trump said he had numerous definitions of this and that he would give his definition when he arrived in the Netherlands. But then on arrival in the Netherlands at a press conference with Mark Rutte, Trump said that he was with NATO all the way, that there was no question whatsoever of his commitment. So then maybe there's perhaps another example of how Rutte's strategy of pleasing and flattering the US president is working. Now, I think the bottom line here is that I don't think any European leader, any NATO leader outside of the US is naive enough at this stage to think that Trump's behaviour on this topic is predictable. For months now, for years now, European leaders have been saying we can no longer rely on the US in the way we used to when it comes to defence. The transatlantic partnership is not the same. Under Trump, the US has consistently shown itself to be unpredictable on these questions. That example I just gave about what he said pre and before the flight shows that. And I don't think anything that happens at this meeting is going to change that fundamental reality.
Arthur Sullivan in Berlin, DW correspondent, thanks for being with us.